I think you're on mute.
Workday starting to sound the same?
I think you're on mute.
Find something that sounds better for your career on LinkedIn. With LinkedIn Job Collections, you can browse curated collections by relevant industries and benefits, like flex PTO or hybrid workplaces, so you can find the right job for you. Get started at linkedin.com/jobs. Finding where you fit. LinkedIn knows how.
This episode is brought to you by eBay. We all have that piece. The one that's so you've basically become known for it. And if you don't yet, fashionistas, you'll find it on eBay. That Miu Miu red leather bomber, the Custo Barcelona cowboy top, or that Patagonia fleece in the 2017 colorway. All these finds are all on eBay, along with millions of more main character pieces backed by authenticity guarantee. eBay is the place for pre-loved and vintage fashion. eBay, things people love.
I'm Stephen Metcalf, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest. Can Materialists revive the Rom-com edition? It's Wednesday, June 18th, 2025. On today's show, Materialists stars Dakota Johnson as a high-end matchmaker in New York City who finds herself caught between Pedro Pascal, an improbably decent private equity rich guy, and her ex-boyfriend, a struggling actor played by Chris Evans. The movie is written and directed by Celine Song, known for her widely admired first feature, Past Lives. And then the Titan submarine fiasco seems like an all-too-perfect allegory for the times, by which a rich dumbshit thinks he's going to disrupt the world of deep submersibles only to end up killing himself and others. There is now a deep-dive documentary on Netflix about it. We discuss Titan, the OceanGate Submersible Disaster. And finally, Brian Wilson, one of American music's true visionaries. It cannot be exaggerated enough. He is certainly on any Rushmore, however you configured it, of American geniuses of pop music. Co-founder, of course, and principal songwriter behind the Beach Boys, has died. We will discuss with Slate's own Carl Wilson. But first joining me is Dan Kois, Slate writer extraordinaire and author of the novel Hampton Heights, among other books. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, Dana. Hey, Dana Stevens, film critic for Slate. Hey.
Hey. Boring old me, still sitting over here.
Just happy to bring some fresh blood to the table.
That's really bad. What should I say? Author of the amazing book about Buster
about
Keaton.
My intro. Just pointing out that I'm boring and old.
I'm terrified for what that makes me, Dana, if you're boring and old. But we have not boring and very fresh topics to discuss. I think this is a good run today. All right, Celine Song could not have had a more promising debut as a filmmaker. Her feature, Past Lives, was a critical darling, and it was nominated for Best Picture and Screenplay. She returns now with Materialists, a kind of sort of rom-com. We'll get into that. It stars Dakota Johnson as a Manhattan matchmaker. Her job is to appraise people coldly for their selling points in a marriage market. And we hear her over and over again overlaying on actual human beings a kind of mental spreadsheet detailing looks, background, education, and money. Money, money, money. At the wedding of a client, she meets the brother of the groom, played by Pedro Pascal, and he's what, in her business, is called a true unicorn. He's tall, handsome, seemingly thoughtful and kind, and very, very, very rich. Twist, he likes her. He doesn't want to be a client of the firm. He likes her, but at the same event, her ex, played by Chris Evans, is a cater waiter, and they reconnect. And suddenly, she finds herself caught between love and money, but can she even tell the difference anymore? Okay, in the clip we're going to hear when Dakota Johnson's character first meets Pedro Pascal's, and he tries to sell her on his charms while she tries to sell him on her services. Let's listen.
Love is easy.
Is it? I find it to be the most difficult thing in the world.
That's because we can't help it. It just walks into our lives sometimes.
Are you kidding on me?
Definitely not. But I do think that you would be a great match for a lot of our clients. We need more straight men in New York City. You look about 6 feet tall. How much money do you make?
Just straight up like that.
I make $80,000 a year before taxes. Do you make more or less than that?
More.
I know. Finance, right?
private equity. Do you want a drink?
Sure.
What do you want?
Coke and beer.
And we should say that's Chris Evans. Who
Those clinking sounds.
drops the Coke and the beer like Deus Ex frickin' Machina because he spotted her across the room, remembers what she drinks, and there it is. Dana, let me start with you. There such curiously mixed feelings about this movie seem to be circulating about. I have not read your review. I'm dying for you to tell me what I should think of it.
I mean, I myself am ambivalent and divided about it. I think I like it less than when I reviewed it, and I already did not give it a glowing review. It's a perplexing movie because it has many, many elements in place that are very appealing. The casting of the three major stars is kind of perfect, although I think we can have a separate conversation about whether Dakota Johnson is quite at the level of performance that I think those two guys are. But she is perfectly cast in this role, I think. And the idea of a glossy love triangle rom-com directed by Celine Song, whose last movie was a less comic love triangle, right? I mean, it's, in a way, this is sort of a glossy Hollywood remake of the same sort of structure of a woman choosing between two men. That's all great. Also, which I say right up top of my review, I think it's really refreshing, the idea that a rom-com comes straight out and talks about things like how much money do the characters make? You know, what are their sort of material circumstances? Because it's always been this sort of joking critique of rom-coms, like how does Anne Hathaway's editorial assistant in The Devil Wears Prada afford her darling one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, right? It's something that's always kind of shoved under the table, like where are the resources coming from? Here, it's right on top of the table. In fact, it is the stakes of the plot. So that's all good and promising. But I have to say that for me, especially in retrospect now, having seen it a couple weeks ago and written on it and reading different people's responses to it, that this movie was a real disappointment. It feels so schematic, like the kind of conversation we just heard in that clip is almost exclusively the only kind of conversation that anyone in the movie has for the first, I don't know, hour nearly, right? Everybody is constantly assessing and, as you say, applying spreadsheets to each other's characteristics. And I just feel like in the real world, even if people feel that way, they don't talk that way all the time. You know, everybody knows that you're supposed to have a soul and you're sort of supposed to at least pretend that you care about other values. And there's something so on the table. I mean, I think a couple of reviews have really gotten at this. Aisha Harris, formerly of Slate, wrote on this for NPR and was talking about a moment when Pedro Pascal's character and Dakota Johnson's are out on one of their early dates. They're having one of these very assessing materialist conversations. And she says something like, but you shouldn't want to date me. I'm cold. I'm terrible. All I care about is money. And then he has like a charming rejoinder. But as Aisha points out, everyone in the audience is kind of nodding along like, yeah, you are kind of awful. And I think here's where I'm going to throw it to Dan, because I know he and I disagree slightly about Past Lives, Celine Song's debut film, which he liked better than I did. But I think that this shares the key problem that Past Lives had, although Past Lives is a far superior movie, which is that it's kind of a Mary Sue heroine. You know, that expression, like the sort of heroine who can do no wrong. And even when she commits morally bad acts, she's immediately forgiven for them. That is a real problem with this Dakota Johnson character. I can't quite get into why without spoiling too many important things, but like no matter how much she messes up, everybody always forgives her. I don't know. Dan, tell me that this is not a Mary Sue story.
Mary Sue story is a funny way to think about this because typically in a Mary Sue, you don't have the audience nodding along when the character says she's terrible. You have a real Mary Sue story fools the audience into thinking that the character is great. So that when the character makes that kind of quasi-confession, the audience, along with Pedro Pascal, is like, no, we're also in love with you, Dakota Johnson.
Doesn't Celine Song want us to be saying we, like Pedro Pascal, are in love with her?
Yeah, I mean, the argument is, at least that Aisha is making, is that she hasn't pulled it off.
Right.
But I don't know that that is actually the argument that she wants us to be making. I mean, I think she's made a very specific choice to center this movie on a character who, in fact, has made a decision in her life to dispense with her soul. It's not that she can't remember that people are supposed to pretend to have souls and to care about things other than money. It's that at some past point in her life, because of Chris Evans, she made the decision that she can't afford to be that person. She no longer is going to care about those things, and she's going to conduct her life and romantic affairs along purely materialistic lines. She's made an active decision that that's the right way to treat love in the 21st century, which I think is a little different than pitching a character who we're supposed to believe just can't access her hidden depths because she's made a mistake about what it is that really she brings to the table. She knows what she brings to the table, but she's decided she doesn't care about that anymore. She's decided that the only possible path to future happiness for her is in making these extremely analytic, borderline sociopathic decisions about the people she might potentially one day date. And I didn't mind that. Like I found that just as refreshing in this movie as I found the movie's willingness to be slightly sociopathic about how much money all its characters make in a way that most movies, as you say, don't do. I feel like the first half of this movie sets out all the ideas and contains all these conversations in which people are almost exclusively talking about the ideas. And then the second half of the movie is trying to dramatize them and make you care about the ramifications of these ideas and ideals in the real lives of these characters. And it doesn't really pull that off. Like Celine Song hasn't figured out how to meld those two things in the way that she did in Past Lives. That felt like a screenplay that she had polished for like 8 years in multiple Sundance labs. This feels like a screenplay that she wrote really, really fast after Past Lives got a movie deal and was a huge success and maybe could have benefited from a couple more rounds of notes. But in the end, she decided she was depending on the charisma of her stars.
She has actually said that she had this script before Past Lives was made, but
and
I agree it feels rushed.
And also, so very quickly, I would say that this movie had me in the palm of its hand for about 45 minutes with a couple of quibbles, but by and large, I was laughing along with it in a very packed house in Brooklyn. I thought how extraordinary a couple of things right away struck me. First of all, it is an old screenplay for her in part because she was a matchmaker in New York City. And so what I found most authentic about the movie was its depiction of that world and the mentality behind it, which is, funnily enough, it's a mixture of two things. It's both the absolute perfect personification of a marketized mentality relative to human beings and the quote-unquote value that they bring to a dating or a marriage market, and her ability to absolutely, in an ice-cold, like, ice water in her vein way, appraise people for their market value is set off against her status as a middle woman, right? Because her job actually is mediating the unrealistic expectations of two different parties so that they somehow meet in the middle and form something like a realistic notion both of themselves and therefore what they can get and expect from others. And so there are these wonderful montages where you see her, from her point of view, you don't actually see Dakota Johnson, but you see what she's looking at in a cafe with clients or prospective clients describing what they want, which is so preposterously out of proportion to who they are and what they're bringing. And it's a study in self-blindness of the market mentality, which of course sees everything and appraises everything perfectly except itself in some sense. I thought all of that was extraordinary. I thought Dakota Johnson was a movie star for the first half of this movie, full stop. I thought the question of whether she could do it, whether she's a third-generation Nepo baby, all of that to me was out the window. In fact, that kind of low-affect, milky, cold, milky, silky voice she has, I thought was perfect for a person occupying precisely that social position. But the problem that I had, and the warning sign, was that the Pedro Pascal character is a total cipher. It does nothing with the immense charms of that actor and is totally uncomplicated in some ways. I mean, I suppose maybe it's like he's boring and that's the problem. But there's no texture to him. You just get sort of two facts about him, which is that he has that Pedro Pascal elan and essential goodness, which is so anomalous for a male movie star of his attributes. Invested then in a person who's made an enormous amount of money in private equity, which, by the way, happens to be one of the most evil ways to make money within the capitalist system, which is really saying something. And you get
certainly on the Rushmore of evil ways to make money.
It really is. And we get none of that texture, right? He's just kind of a type, and Pascal's given very little to do. And then the second half of the movie, exactly as you say, Dana, is just basically people become talking essays, and the whole thing is totally schematic. And inert and dramatically inert. And I was so heartbroken because I really thought a rom-com had brought to the surface what a market mentality has done to people's ability to inhabit a human subjectivity that is capable of then reaching outside itself with love and care toward another, right? It's come fucking close to destroying it. And I thought that this was treating that in an interesting and conscious way, right? That movie about the person who narcotized their ability to think and feel in order to give themselves over to pricing other human beings' prospects and has to walk that back in order to find connection. I thought that was almost there. It was so close, and it just didn't land. I was bummed.
That is funny because this is that movie. This movie does have that thread running through it, and you see it over and over again with her, which she then has to deal with Chris Evans.
I don't disagree. And I just want to say, Dana, do you agree with me? Pedro Pascal had too little to do, but you can always look at Pedro Pascal. I thought Chris Evans was wonderful in this movie. I actually thought he's cursed with too good looks, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly the best character in the movie. I mean, both sort of the best person, like the nicest guy, and I think though you could argue that he's pretty schematic too, the out-of-work actor who's a cater waiter. He's not given a lot of characteristics, but he creates the most full human being in the movie, for sure. Yeah. And at first, I would have thought, I may say this in my review, that he's too good-looking for that part. You just don't believe that he would be sort of that much of a scrub at that age. But that's the upgrade that every rom-com gets, right? You have to choose between two hunky guys.
All right. The movie is Materialists.
Some people love it, we should say.
Some people love it, and it is the third highest opening for A24. So it's doing by the standards of A24. Very good business so far. We'll see if it has any kind of legs, and let us know what you thought of it. All right, let's move on.
Let us know if you actually liked it, like me.
Well, it's summertime and the temperature is rising. Maybe it's time to start refreshing your closet and seeing if there's some improvements you could make on your summer wardrobe. If so, maybe you should think about checking out Quince. Their clothes are timeless, but they certainly have lots of seasonal pieces for the season we're moving into. As always, when we talk about Quince, Steve, I got to throw over to you because even though I like the company and have quite a few of their things, I think you're the Quince collector on our panel. Tell me about some summer items that you like from them.
I mean, the thing that so everything I've gotten from them, I love and I wear. Like that's where the pudding gets proofed, right? Or you buy an item of clothing, especially off the internet. How often is it in the rotation? How reliable is it? Especially as the weather begins to warm up, when I have an item of theirs that's weather appropriate to wear, I know it'll be fine, easily matched with what else I have, like a decent pair of jeans. Especially, for example, their linen shirts. It's a little bit heavier without sacrificing breathability. So just to give you the full name of the product, it's 100% European linen, relaxed, long sleeve pocket shirt, and that is a great shirt.
All right. Well, if that sounded tempting to you, and if you want to support a company that only works with safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices, then give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/culture for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/culture to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/culture. It's the moment in the show when we talk about the business. We have two items of business this week. The first is to say that we are still keeping the playlist open for this year's Summer Strut episode, which is coming up in August. You have until the end of this month, roughly a week, to submit a song or up to 3 songs to our playlist. You can send it to culturefest@slate.com, and please put Strut25 in the subject line so we can easily find it. And we will put you into our ever-growing Spotify list. I believe it's up to over 20 hours now of music. We're going to listen to it over the next month, and we'll come back to you in August with our short list of favorites. The only other item of business is to tell you about our Slate Plus segment today. We're going to talk about a little New Yorker piece by Lauren Michelle Jackson about P.O.V, which means many things, right? I mean, it could mean a point of view in an artistic work of art. She's talking specifically about the social media use of the phrase P.O.V and the way that on TikTok, P.O.V has been frequently twisted to mean its very opposite. In other words, you're not looking at something from the point of view of a particular subject. You are simply looking at something. And so we'll talk about that in our Plus episode this week, which you will get separately in your feed if you're a Slate Plus member. If you're not a Slate Plus member, please consider becoming one by going to slate.com/culture plus. When you're a member, you get ad-free podcasts, you get bonus content like the extra episode I just described. Many other shows have them too. And of course, you get unlimited access to the writing and the podcasting on slate.com. These memberships are really what keep the magazine afloat, so please consider signing up today at slate.com/culture plus. Once again, that's slate.com/culture plus. Or you can sign up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page. All right, back to the show.
Stockton Rush could trace his ancestry back to the signing of the Declaration, but not content to be an old money twit, he decided he wanted to be a founder CEO in the Elon Musk mold. What, however, to disrupt now that the internet is played and Earth's landed surface is exhausted and Bezos and Musk were colonizing space between them? Stockton Rush looked at the ocean and he dreamed big. He would own its depths, but he knew he had to start relatively small. Start by disrupting the submersible business. How? By evading every known regulation while charging rich people an arm and a leg to look at the Titanic silently rotting on the ocean floor. In the end, he and a crew member and a cohort of paying customers ended up dead on the ocean floor. Titan, the OceanGate Submersible Disaster, is a meticulously detailed examination of Russia's megalomania as it led onto an entirely preventable disaster. As such, of course, it serves as an all too apposite metaphor for the times. I should say it's on Netflix. It seems to be a big hit there. In the clip, we will hear one of the hires up at the company wondering at Russia's decision-making, and then we hear the man himself in all of his lunatic inglory. Let's have a listen.
Why test something with people in it? I don't understand that. To me, it was just sheer arrogance.
I don't want anybody there. I don't want anybody in this company who is uncomfortable with what we're doing. We're doing weird shit here, and I am definitely out of the mold. There's no question. I'm doing things that are completely non-standard, and I'm sure the industry thinks I'm a fucking idiot. That's fine. They've been doing that for 8 years, and I'm going to continue on the way I'm doing, but I'm not going to force people to join my religion if they don't want to.
I didn't know what to say, but I was blown away that at this point they were willing to play Russian roulette.
This is a gobsmacker. This is about roughly 2 hours long, and you wouldn't think that the backstory would necessarily grip you, but these guys, it takes 2 hours to show you every corner that was cut along the way to getting that thing towards the bottom of the ocean and killing innocent people. What'd you make of this?
It made me really glad that when I worked for a terrible boss, the only thing he did was make movies, not send people 4,000 meters under the sea. This is a portrait of a guy, as you say, who desperately wanted to be a big swinging dick. That's a term he uses and loves to describe the Elon Musks of the world, and who therefore made a bad bet. And then he stuck with that bet to the very end. And a thing that I found haunting about this documentary and about the story in general is how it becomes clear that this dummy, was trapped and doomed long before he got into that submarine on the final trip. The set of decisions he'd made because of the way he thought of himself had put him on this path, and his stubbornness caused him to refuse to ever deviate from that path, no matter how many people told him it was a bad idea. And so it was like he locked himself in that submarine 8 years ago, and then it finally imploded. But one thing that is unique about this story is that, unlike in all of the rest of those stories, the rich guy himself also pays the price. Like, he has a kind of demented honor. It's like, this is the movie you would make if Elon Musk was so self-deluded that he put himself on every one of his rockets.
Well, I was thinking the entire time I was watching it, I wish Elon Musk would be just this degree stupider and that he would get on one of his rockets and solve so many of our problems. I mean, I think a remarkable thing about watching this story unfold, the documentary could have been better. It could have included, I think, a little bit more, for example, about the other people who were on that doomed mission. I would have wanted to know more about those billionaires and why they chose to get on that submersible. It is true that at that point, the OceanGate Submersible had done this trip successfully a few times. But as one of the interviewees points out, I think every summer there were 25 missions, right? There were 25 possibilities that you could have gone down to the Titanic, and I think it happened a total of 9 times, over 3 summers.
Right, but they use that as evidence of their dominant safety culture.
Right, that there were moments that they didn't choose to do completely suicidal and stupid things. But the thing that's remarkable in watching this clearly doomed business unfold is that you see that psychology, the disruptor Elon Musk type of dynamic boiled down to its essence, because it's such a small scale, right? It's just one guy and his org chart is really small. And you actually see, this is one of the smarter uses of graphics in the doc, you see the org chart get kind of thinner and thinner as different people say, I'm out of here, including that wonderful Scottish engineer, David Lockridge, who we heard get interviewed, who's in a way the hero of the documentary. And there's a terrible story about him later being legally pursued by Stockton Rush because he tried to be a whistleblower and failed. Yeah, to actually see it unfold over the course of a pretty short period of time with a small group of people and without the charisma. I'm not saying that Elon Musk is charismatic. To me, he is the opposite. He's one of the most repellent human beings. But he is somebody who has managed to create a mythology around himself that's convinced many, many people, right? That he's brilliant, that he's, innovative, that he's doing all these disruptive things. This guy, Stockton Rush, is just kind of a dud. Like, he wasn't a successful engineer. They show his report cards in college
so mean.
And at boarding school, and they're, all just very mediocre. He's almost more like a George W. Bush kind of type, somebody who's a scion of an old family, but he doesn't really have any talent. And he's not even a particularly good, mover of hearts and minds. He is just a deluded guy who really wants to promote himself and to do something that's considered successful. And so to watch him kind of wanly try to whip up people's enthusiasm, you really learn a lot about that kind of person, seeing him at close range like that. The critic Jacob Aller, whose writing I tend to like a lot, wrote on this documentary for AV Club, and he says, this is a documentary that simply seeks to make its audience say, well, duh. And it does a little bit have that feeling. I mean, it sounds very callous to say it, but when you start out knowing that this idiotic guy put himself at risk and others at risk, 5 others, I think, died in that same disaster, including a legendary French oceanographer who sort of seems like the Jacques Cousteau of his time. And they all died in order to go visit the Titanic, which has been done so many times. It's such a tourist destination. I understand that there's a lot of hobbyists who care about the Titanic, but they were hardly breaking new ground in going to visit it.
Funnily enough, I thought this is, an occasion for us to rail against this, megalomaniacal personality type that now dominates the public landscape, thin-skinned blamer. I thought it was more interesting than that. It held my attention and dropped my jaw several times to the fucking bottom of the ocean floor. The ability to evade inspection and regulation and oversight. I mean, he figured what really is interesting is watching this 2-bit Machiavellian find every vulnerability in the system that will allow his boat to evade inspection. And the reason is he had in his head a business model. This was specifically how he was going to disrupt it. In order to build one of these things that doesn't implode at the bottom of the ocean under that amount of pressure, it has to be incredibly heavy because it's basically built out of titanium and other very heavy materials. It therefore is enormously cumbersome and expensive to transport, which ends up being maybe the major expense after it's been built in getting people to the bottom of the ocean. He fucks everything up. He cuts every corner in order to never be inspected. He sails out of like Jamaica under no flag, right? He begins to ignore the data that he's receiving, the acoustic data that he's receiving, which tells you that it is cracking the very boat that he keeps taking down. And then to save money, he stores the thing in the dead of fucking winter somewhere ice cold. I can't remember where. Like Newfoundland. Okay. This is a guy who has a guy who deals with his house because he himself has never experienced that small cracks, for example, in the foundation of a house, if they get water in them and then that water freezes, the freezing water expands and the crack gets bigger and your foundation is fucked. And so he just leaves the thing out over the winter and then it fails the following
on the first dive.
And so you're watching it and you're like, yeah, I have a highly personal animus towards this particular doofus and for everything you represent. But we live in a world filled with cracks. Like that's the metaphor, right? Like we all have decided to spin out a shoddily made carbon fiber world where if you're fucking cynical enough and deluded enough, you will find the little cracks and insinuate yourself into them on the lottery ticket that you too will become Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. And now everything is freaking breaking.
And then to extend that metaphor, we're all living in this world, and every year we hear the carbon fibers crack and pop more and more and more and more and more. And yet whoever it is who's driving this submarine simply will not be taking it up to the surface anytime soon. We're all stuck in there with him.
And is surrounded by incredibly impressive, sober, serious-minded people who keep sounding the warning, not just these little acoustic pops on your screen, right? It's like actual human beings who know what the tolerances
who are writing memos.
Right? So experts. So again, you've got like the allegory just keeps extending itself out. You've got the fucking expert class acting like experts. And no. The trump card is held by the megalomaniac.
It's also really, really galling that two different women who worked for the organization, one of them was the accountant and one was the very young kind of, she was an oceanographer of some kind, but, had never piloted a submersible, was essentially there to be a junior partner. Both of them were asked at one point, oh, do you want to get trained as a submersible pilot? Because we really want a woman as the face of our company. It would be so awesome if we had the first woman. They were just like sacrificing these two women. There's a really funny moment where the one who was the bookkeeper says, I'm an accountant. And that was the moment she realized I need to leave this company.
Get away. Okay, so I've withheld, speaking of trump cards, my trump card. I knew Stockton Rush. I went to high school with Stockton Rush. Stockton Rush was in my dormitory at Phillips Exeter Academy, where I got even worse grades than Stockton Rush.
Well, then you can start a fantastic company.
Exactly.
What was he like?
Our company is going to go beneath the Titanic and look up through the rotted hull. Okay, so get in now. Okay, so here's the thing about Stockton Rush. I did not put two and two together because I read about this story. I was like, God, who is that freaking guy? And then someone said, well, he was in our dorm. I was like, what? He said, Talk. Well, he went as Talk back then. Talk Rush. I was like,
Talk was his nickname?
Yep. Talk. Really that was all he was known as. I had no idea. And so Talk Rush, he was 2 grades ahead of me. And this is going to be the only time I got kicked out of Exeter. I hated it. It was the only time I'm going to defend Exeter. Everybody was onto that fucking guy. Everyone thought him as a fucking haircut and no brains and a total salesman type and just a dipshit, right? Like the one thing Exeter kids circa 1980 had is they were fucking cynical about and judgmental about other people to a fault, believe me. And people were like, that guy's he's just an empty suit. Like, now I know what happened to him.
And these days, once upon a time, for Talk to create a multi-million-dollar company would have required the support of like 50 of those types. These days, he doesn't need that. He just needs, a good carbon fiber 3D printer and enough engineers from UW to help him execute his vision.
All right. Well, it's called Titan, the OceanGate Submersible Disaster. I actually think, weirdly, even knowing the ending and already feeling the rage, going in, actually, that was worth watching.
Yeah, I agree. It's not breaking any new documentary ground, but it's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called AutoQuote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
If there's one thing to learn from the entertainment industry, it's just how easy it is to earn a reputation, even if it doesn't reflect who celebrities really are. For example, everybody thinks that Discover is a card that isn't widely accepted, but in reality, it's accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. Yeah, 99%. So maybe now you'll think twice before judging a book by its cover. Unless it's a celebrity cookbook, in that case, judge away. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/credit card.
The Beach Boys emerged as the maybe preeminent American answer to the British invasion in the early 60s, the most distinctively American of American bands, a distillation of the frontier of hedonism and innocence, aka California, the Cali of surfing and cars and girls. At the heart of the band was its chief songwriter, Brian Wilson, who, as the band went forward especially, could not help putting his own brokenness and melancholy, not to mention his own virtuosic abilities as a melodist and arranger, into his songs. These two tendencies culminated in what is widely regarded as one of a handful of the greatest albums of all time, Pet Sounds. Brian Wilson died this past week after a long struggle with dementia and mental illness. We're joined by Carl Wilson, no relation, and the music critic for Slate to discuss a really gigantic legacy. Hey, Carl, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Carl, I'm just going to say this running together at absolute extremes of a longing for innocence and the necessary heartbreak at the center of that very American longing. Pick a song where maybe early on in the Beach Boys' career, you know, the Help Me Rhonda Beach Boys is starting to give way to the melancholy and brokenness.
Yeah, I mean, it's there from very early on. We could listen to, for example, In My Room from 1963.
There's a world where I can go and tell my secrets to. In my room, in my room.
All right, well, Carl, I just want you to vamp on Brian Wilson and the genius of Brian Wilson, but I'll maybe give you a starting point, which is, did you have that moment that a lot of people have attested to where the light bulb went off and you realized that this was like, this isn't like the Beach Boys of all bands, there was a Mozart at the heart of it?
Yeah, I think that at least for a certain kind of generation in between the contemporary and the sort of 60s heyday of the Beach Boys themselves, that we needed to go through that process because in the 70s, the Beach Boys legacy was pushed as this very all-American conservative kind of celebration. And, in the Reagan era as well, Mike Love was happy to play along with that kind of use of the band's kind of inherently nostalgic part of its identity. And so, in my case, it was David Thomas of the avant-punk band Perubu, being a devotee of Brian Wilson that woke me up to it. But a lot of people came to it in various ways through various kinds of covers or just by hearing some of the songs that are, just off the radar of those sort of top 20 surf classics, and had to realize the importance of Brian Wilson. I think his fellow musicians always understood that importance. There was a line in the Times obit for Brian Wilson that pointed out that Surfer Girl from 1963 may be the first song in American popular music that was produced, written, arranged, and performed by the same person. And, that fact on its own is kind of mind-blowing and indicative of the sort of technical brilliance of Wilson. One of the reasons that I wanted to listen to In My Room is that the image of Brian Wilson alone in a room is kind of predictive of a whole legacy following on from him of sort of solitary genius, but also what the people can do with technology and the studio that, running through Prince and into the sort of auteur producers of today, somebody like Pharrell is also a direct descendant of Brian Wilson. So there's so many levels on which you can talk about his brilliance.
For me, as I started to learn who Brian Wilson was and what the Beach Boys represented beyond Kokomo.
Which Brian Wilson had nothing to do with, by the way.
Right, but which to a person exactly my age was the thing you had to fight through the number one status of Kokomo was the thing you had to fight through to come to understand that the Beach Boys meant something bigger than that. But the notion of him in his room became really archetypal for me, and it points to what for me was the compelling story of his career as I was coming to understand his genius, which was the long story of Smile and its legacy, which was different in the 90s when I was learning about it than it is now. But, I think of how he sort of became this blueprint for the lost genius alone, trying to make something perfect and never quite being able to succeed. But then even that changed. Carl, how do you think about Smile these days after its sort of second and third lives?
So Smile was the album after Pet Sounds, which is now much more than it was at the time of the sort of recognized milestone of Wilson's genius. It's ranked number 2 on Rolling Stone's most recent list of the greatest albums of all time, even though it wasn't a huge hit in its day. But it's canonical now. Smile was supposed to be the follow-up to that album. But during that time, Wilson was going through a period of intense drug use and increasing paranoia and hallucinations. And the sessions for Smile just kind of legendarily eccentric, involving making the musicians dress up in costumes and using all kinds of sort of non-musical sounds and all of these things. They just ran ashore, and he couldn't complete the project, and it was finally completed in 2004 with the help of a younger generation of indie musicians who had grown up with that legend. Let's listen to Cabinescence, maybe.
Find a meadow filled with reindeer. I'll give you a home on the
In some ways, Smile was more interesting as a non-completed legend, and kind of more inspiring that way. It was just really from what we can hear, it was a kind of imaginative leap forward, but nothing can kind of live up to that legend. But that story, Brian Wilson sitting in a sandbox with a piano, all in his bathrobe, never coming out of his room, all of these stories became this kind of totem of the idea of the doomed genius in ways I think that are excessively romanticist about the nature of creativity, and in some ways overlooked the underlying story of disability and mental illness that ran to the beginning of his story, and the abuse that he and his brothers suffered under their father, who was also their manager in the early days, Murray Wilson. So it's one of those rock legends that conceals as much as it reveals. But I totally agree, it was very key to the way that whole generations of people understood Wilson, and it helped undermine, again, that kind of sunny image of the Beach Boys by presenting this kind of flip side.
Carl, I had a specific question for you about Wilson, but I wanted to start off with just my own kind of story of falling in love with the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson, which I think probably happened in the mid-'90s when I was dating, living with, in love with an indie musician who was making his first album and was at that stage of, production, kind of deciding which musicians to bring in, how to orchestrate things, and had always been a huge Beach Boys fan, but became obsessed with Pet Sounds and all the uses of sound, all the inventive uses of sound on it. And the way that, as has been said many times, that Wilson could use the recording studio as an instrument in itself. And I just remember in particular that my boyfriend at the time just loved all these non-musical sounds, which you mentioned earlier on Pet Sounds, like above all, the bicycle bell on You Still Believe in Me, right? This kind of very nostalgic sound of a child's bicycle bell or horn that honks throughout the song. But also just crazy things like the fact that Wouldn't It Be Nice opens with 2 accordions that are doing the rhythm section. Pet Sounds, of course, famously, and maybe this is where the title comes from, ends with the sound of a dog barking at a train. I mean, things that now you can imagine indie musicians throwing this kind of stuff in, but in the 1960s, the mid-60s, for somebody to be doing that was just so strange and so striking. So I guess I wanted to share that and then just ask you if you had any thoughts about the weird sounds that Brian Wilson loved to throw into everything.
I mean, I think all of that is indicative of the kind of ear that Wilson had. You know, those impulses were of a piece with, you know, what experimental musicians were doing in other forms at the time. You can sort of think of John Cage as a pioneer of thinking of every sound as a musical sound on some level. And Wilson came to those kinds of insights instinctively, as he did so much with the ways that he created sound worlds. To me, there's something about the ecumenicism of Wilson's musical imagination that speaks to what I think is the relevant part of his kind of neuroatypicality. And I can relate it just as much to the fact that he wanted to kind of create these little symphonies out of surf music as to the more ambitious things that he was trying to do later in the 60s. To him, I think all material was kind of grist for the same kind of sensual and exploratory approach to sound, no matter what the subject matter, no matter what the instrument, no matter what the musicians that he was working with. It all kind of fed into this interior sound world.
Right. I mean, the specific mental illness that he was diagnosed with, I think one of the early ones was that he had auditory hallucinations, which is sort of a fantastic match with what everyone has upon listening to Pet Sounds, right? It induces auditory hallucinations. I was also so fascinated to learn something I didn't know about Brian Wilson, which is that he was almost deaf in one ear, possibly because of the result of his father's abuse. At times he said it was that his father had hit him. At times he said he had gotten into a schoolyard fight or something, but he was almost deaf on one side. And I read one critic saying, well, imagine what music he could have made if he had hearing on both sides. But I feel like it's maybe almost the opposite, you know, that the fact that he had that kind of auditory glitch, you know, maybe caused him to listen and hear in a different way.
Yeah, it's kind of almost impossibly symbolically overweighted, from everything from why the mono mixes of Beach Boys songs are better than the stereo mixes for the most part, to the sense that there was something kind of beautifully lopsided about his creativity, you know, and then the way that the abuse and the creativity are kind of inextricably linked in his story. All of these kinds of things, you know, it's you can make so much of.
Yeah. So here's my origin story for what it's worth. About the Beach Boys, I was in like 7th or 8th grade, discovered the joys of tuning out the world with a pair of headphones and listened to rock radio for hours on end, worshiping the usual names. But not the Beach Boys. Hated them. That was bubblegum. That was garbage. And I was sort of lying in a half nap state, like that liminal, neither asleep nor awake. And on came Good Vibrations. And I was just too out of it and too tired to switch the station, which I normally would have done. And by the end of it, I was like, oh my fucking God. It was something about having my conscious mind half turned off. And I got by all the prejudices at once. And then suddenly a story that I'd heard before made sense to me for the first time, which is that there was this ping pong ball going over the Atlantic between Lennon and McCartney and Brian Wilson, which, you know, starts with, according to Brian Wilson, starts with him hearing Rubber Soul, and he makes Pet Sounds. And then according to George Martin, they make Sgt. Pepper's. And I was like, of course. But the crazy thing is he was both George Martin and the Beatles, Wilson, which is just extraordinary. Why don't we, Carl, how does this sound for a way out of the segment on something of a definitely very appreciative, but also maybe a happy note, which is that Pet Sounds didn't sell. It made to 10th, I think, on the charts, which was disappointing and in some ways maybe even a little bit crushing to Brian Wilson. And then, of course, there's the Wipeout, making Smile. And then they come out with Smiley Smile, which is an album of mixed strengths and weaknesses, but Good Vibrations is on it. And it's like gotta be in the conversation about one of his masterpieces, and of course was a commercial triumph for the band. What do you think about maybe ending on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, Wilson had some creative peaks later on, but in some ways, Good Vibrations is the all-in-one. You know, it took months and months and months of sessions with all kinds of studio musicians. Wilson at the most exacting and demanding phase of his visionariness, and the layers of sound, the way that it captures kind of a California groove, and particularly the right moment, anticipating the sort of coming summer of love. You know, Good Vibrations is just really, along with some of his other songs of the period, is kind of a landmark in American popular music.
Gentle wind on the wind that lifts her perfume through the air. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations.
Wait a second. We have Carl Wilson on a hot mic, and he's on the third segment. It's staring us in the face. Carl, would you stick around and endorse with us, please?
I'd be more than happy to.
Today's episode is sponsored by NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. Making financial decisions shouldn't feel like trying to pick a place to eat with friends. Too many choices. Everyone has an opinion on what's worth it. One person says, invest in crypto. Another says, go all in on real estate. Meanwhile, you're just trying to figure out if your credit card's annual fee will ever pay off. That's where the nerds come in. NerdWallet's finance journalists do the research so you don't have to, breaking down the fine print, cutting through misinformation, and giving you real, fact-based insights so you can make smart financial moves without the group chat chaos. NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast can help you get smarter about using home equity without over-leveraging yourself, and when refinancing actually saves you money and when it doesn't. Want to know if dividend stocks or growth stocks make more sense for you? Listen to the nerds. They also help decipher the real difference between ETFs and mutual funds without the jargon. Make your next financial move with confidence. Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app. And stay tuned until the end of the episode to hear the Smart Money trailer.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game, shifting a little money here, a little there, just hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill, too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Yeah, all right. Now is the moment in our podcast when we endorse Dana.
I'm going to endorse something related to our Brian Wilson topic. I believe I've already endorsed this movie. It's even possible we did a segment on it, but I know I saw it on an airplane the year it came out, was blown away by it, and then it came up again when researching this Brian Wilson segment. It's a documentary about him from 2021. It's called Long Promised Road, which is the title of a Beach Boys song, actually not written by Brian, but by Carl Wilson. And it's unusual because Brian Wilson agreed to participate in the documentary. So it's less of an overview of his career, though there is a lot of great archival stuff in it, than just Brian Wilson driving around with a Rolling Stone writer named Jason Fine, who's his friend, who's one of the few people in the world that he is comfortable opening up to. And the director just films them driving around to different locations in LA that had a history with the Beach Boys or in Brian Wilson's life and talking about them. And so in addition to getting to hear a lot of great music and see some studio footage from the old days and things like that, you just get a sense of who he was as a person. And he's just so overwhelmingly lovable, extremely fragile and vulnerable, very open about the fact that, you know, he's scared of the world and that everyday life is hard for him. There's a really beautiful moment where they go to a beach at Malibu together that I guess the Beach Boys wrote a song about this particular beach. And Jason Fine, his friend, and Brian Wilson are holding hands as they walk on the beach. And it's really clear that, you know, Wilson just sort of needed someone to hold on to. He's just an extremely lovable figure. And you learn a lot about him and you feel a lot for him. I watched it for a second time talk about him today and cried as I did the first time. So Long Promised Road is the documentary, and you can find it in lots of places. I believe it's on Amazon, Apple, Peacock. It's streaming all over the place.
Yeah, I watched the first 45 minutes of it this morning, rewatched, and it's just heartbreaking. It's so moving. Carl, thanks for sticking around and joining us for endorsements. What do you have?
Well, in a week where we've been thinking about the promise and sometimes destruction of eccentric geniuses, not only through the story of Brian Wilson, but also through the story of Sly Stone, and their death in the same week created so many points of comparison and contrast to think about. I was fortunate on the weekend to go see someone who's falls in that lineage, but is much lesser known. It's the British eccentric surrealist songwriter Robin Hitchcock, who I haven't seen live for decades. And the sheer delight and wit and creativity and musicality of the songs that he's been making for decades and decades, very much coming out of kind of 60s, both British and American musical traditions, was just such a breath of fresh air. And there's also this thing going on in his shows that I think has been going on for a long time that I didn't know about, where people bring him traffic cones because he has one song that mentions that is called September Cones, I believe.
So let's make love in the ocean. September cones.
And circles around that. And then he went into one of his amazing comic surreal monologues about all of the symbolism of traffic cones, by the end of which he'd rendered them symbols of the cosmological nature of gender and much more. And it was just a total oasis sauna of bathing in at once disconnected and deeply human musical creativity, and I just can't recommend more that you go see him live if you do. And there's also a documentary by Jonathan Demme called Storefront Hitchcock that kind of documents what the live experience with Robin Hitchcock is, and so a very heartfelt endorsement there.
Our conversation about Wilson reminded me of a mini endorsement, which is that everyone should take a moment and listen to his 1988 solo album, which has its problems, not least of which is that his former psychologist Eugene Landy was all over the studio making everyone's lives miserable while they were making it. But it is a really fascinating document of how he thought his next act might be as a musician, and it includes several really beautiful songs. It had the bad luck to be released literally the same month as Kokomo. But my real endorsement is that I just rewatched the 1992 movie 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould because I was interviewing the director, Francois Girard, because it's coming to Criterion next week. And I was freshly blown away by this movie, which I hadn't seen since 92, and how innovative and fun and intricate it is as a portrait of an artist, a difficult artist, an artist who had his own challenges. But as a work of art, it just dispenses with so much biopic baloney that now, 30 plus years later seems, essentially required if you're going to make a biopic about a musician. And instead it does what I wish that all art about artists would do, which is that it comes up with as many interesting ways as it can to explore this guy's life and this guy's work and how they interact, which is what I want out of a work of art like this. Just a totally refreshing movie watching experience. When it comes to Criterion, people should remind themselves how fun this movie is.
Yes, I remember that movie so well. I think that was my introduction to who Glenn Gould even was, and it really stuck with me.
I've never seen it, but now I'm absolutely going to. Okay, so I have a very quick double endorsement this week. 2 things that I was tempted to abandon and got convinced to stick with, and I find both have been quite rewarding, though I haven't finished either one. So I started Roberto Bolaño's 2666. Had meant to pick it up forever. I just think the opening bit, Carl, it sounds like you've read it, but the opening part, that tour de force of the 3 scholars kind of establishing the reputation of a 4th writer who they haven't met, and like their interrelationships with one another, it immediately brings you into this world, the kind of world of academics and overthinkers and their own weird, distorted passions as they exalt literature out of the other corner of the mouth. I mean, I thought it was just brilliant. I thought it was remarkable, but it's the very first part of a 1,000-page book, and it goes in these other directions. And I was starting to poop out after 150 pages, and one of our listeners said, no, don't poop out, keep going. And as you plunge into the world of what is, I think, Juarez, but it's called Santa Teresa in the book, and the city, and these serial murders, it's like the world building and the fullness of it, and his ability to write almost in a genre style about killing and detecting and being a journalist and whatever. And this canvas he gives you of this city, this border city, effectively Juarez, it's just so fucking astonishing, and it's such a different book, and I have a sense of how he's going to possibly bring it all together, and I literally have probably 600 pages left to go, and I'm on page 500, but I'm now like turning the pages, like fanning myself with pages. They're flipping so quickly. I'm so in. And then the second on a totally different note is Department Q, which I heard it was a good show, and I was like an hour and a half in. I'm like, I cannot take this supercilious twat at the center of it another second. It really isn't very good. It's not engaging. And suddenly, out of nowhere, I don't know why we were so fucking bored and nothing else to watch. I think it's almost like episode 3. It goes from being a mediocre show to a tremendously well-written, sharply observed genre piece, like almost out of nowhere. It was like it had an identity shift, and all of a sudden, all of the craft and expertise and precision that went into Queen's Gambit, it's the same creator, suddenly clicks in, and it's a completely engaging piece of television. I actually wonder if we shouldn't talk about it, because it's turning into a big hit. I mean, word of mouth is out about it. So those are my 2. Very curious. I haven't finished either one, so no spoilers, but I want to hear what people's own experience or journey is with each of these products. Carl Wilson, thanks for sticking around and endorsing.
My pleasure.
Dan, as always, it's wonderful to have you on the show.
A pleasure.
And Dana, it's best when we're face to face. So much better. Yeah, really fun. You'll find links to some of the things we talked about today at our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest, and you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory music is by the composer Nicholas Patel. What do we call Daniel? Is it production assistant? The title is just so like it doesn't capture the essence of Daniel Hirsch and his contributions to our show. Yes, our very first friend of the program executive production assistant. That's a FAPIPA. Is Daniel Hirsch. Is just so excited to have him. And of course, our producer is Benjamin Frisch, who was already in the pantheon of great producers. So
now he's on top of the pantheon.
He is, yeah.
The
exactly.
Rushmore of great American Culture Gabfest producers.
And no weird acoustic popping sounds indicating he might implode. For all those people, I'm Stephen Metcalf, and thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Today's episode is sponsored by NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast.
Money can be confusing. Should you invest in ETFs, get a travel rewards credit card, buy a house, or just build a really fancy pillow fort?
That could work. No shame in pillow fort game. Or you could just tune in for clear, research-backed financial insights.
I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. We're the hosts of NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, where you bring the money questions and we bring trustworthy information backed by NerdWallet's expert analysis, without the jargon or the sales pitch.
Our nerds do the research so you don't have to. We'll help you understand your options so you can make the best decision for your situation, from optimizing your investments and maximizing credit card rewards to making big money moves with confidence.
Plus, we keep it real. No lectures, no judgment. Just tips and tools you can use to build wealth and take control of your finances. Think of us as your financial GPS, helping you navigate your money decisions and avoid expensive wrong turns.
Whether you're planning for retirement, weighing a big purchase, or just want to make your money work harder for you, we've got insights that you can use in real life.
So, if you want practical, straightforward, and actually useful financial knowledge, plus a little bit of fun along the way, follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
Trust us, future you will thank you.